Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I stand here to speak on behalf of the Taxation Annual Rates, Foreign Superannuation and Remedial Matters Bill, which the Green Party will be supporting, even though we have some significant concerns with the bill. Perhaps the single largest problem with the bill is, of course, the way that the government has chosen to cut tax rates for upper income earners as part of its 2010 signature tax cuts policy. And of course, part of this bill is it continues those tax rates going forward. Now, it is a simple fact that the tax cuts from 2010 meant that the top 10% of income earners were $1.1 billion a year better off. So those basic tax cuts, which the National Party introduced, were a direct transfer of wealth to the top 10% of income earners of around $1.1 billion per year, one of the singular most expensive policies that this government introduced. And so the government prioritised spending, prioritised public money, to spend it on the top 10% of income earners in New Zealand. Now, we live in a country with over 250,000 children living in poverty. Now, you would think that getting money to those 250,000 children would be a top priority for spending $1.1 million every year, year on year on year. But in fact, what the government decided, the National Party government decided, with the support of John Banks and Peter Dunn, and the Māori Party as voting for the budget, was that the priority for spending $1.1 billion, so $1,100 million every year, that's the cost of the tax cuts, the priority for that money was the top 10% of income earners in New Zealand. Now, it beggars belief that this is the value system of this government. The value system of this government says the priority for spending a huge amount of money every year should be those who have the most, instead of saying we should be directing spending to the 270,000 children living in poverty, the kids that can't afford lunches at schools, the kids that can't afford shoes to take them to wear to school. Instead of those kids being the priority for government spending, instead of the kids who are growing up in poverty and can't get a proper education because it's very hard to learn when you're hungry, instead of the National Party prioritising those children, the National Party chose to prioritise giving $1.1 billion every year, year on year on year, it's continuing the spending in every budget, to the top 10% of income earners. And for my mind, that is a completely unethical decision, and I think tells so much about the values of the National Party. Now, the Green Party recently proposed spending about $100 million a year to support children going to Decile 1 to Decile 4 schools, that is the poorest schools in the country, to spend money on those children so that they got a decent lunch, that they got access to welfare services and healthcare at their school. We called it the School Hubs program. The spending involved was $100 million a year or thereabouts, a very significant sum of money. But it is less than 1/10 of what the National Party gave to the top 10% of income earners through the tax cut policy. So the National Party attacked the Green Party for spending lots of money on the poorest children in New Zealand, $100 million a year, a significant sum of money, I totally agree, but we believed that it was the priority. Now, the National Party spends $1.1 billion every year giving money to the top 10% of income earners, and they attack the Green Party because we want to spend 1/10 of that amount to make sure that poor kids get an opportunity to get a decent education. Those are the priorities of the government, of the National Party, the ACT Party. These are the priorities of the Green Party. We believe that that should be in this bill. If you were going to do something about income tax, then why would it be that you think you should give $1.1 billion a year to the top 10%? The other thing, of course, that's remarkable about the tax system in New Zealand and the spending that the government prioritises is the subsidies to the oil industry. So the government subsidises the fossil fuel industry of the order to $40 to $50 million a year. On top of that, there is no price on carbon anymore in New Zealand. Slowly, the government has gutted the emissions trading scheme, and of course there's no carbon charge. So effectively, there is no price on carbon. So, Ministry for the Environment have modelled what will be the effect of the current policies of this government on greenhouse emissions. Ministry for the Environment tell us, according to their official projections, that net greenhouse gas emissions from New Zealand will increase by 50% in the next decade. So, 50% increase in net emissions by New Zealand in the next decade. So that is a result of the current policies of this government. Instead of putting a price on carbon, instead of introducing complementary measures around transport, for example, in order to reduce our greenhouse emissions, the New Zealand government has policies in place that will result in a 50% increase in greenhouse emissions in the next decade, according to the Ministry for the Environment. Now, just think about it for a second. If every country in the world was as irresponsible as this government. I mean, if every country in the world took the attitude, we're going to increase our emissions net emissions by 50%, we would have an even worse climate problem than we've got at the moment. It would be a climate catastrophe. When you look at the floods across southern England at the moment, when you look at the typhoon that has hit the Philippines most recently, these are the kinds of extreme weather events that climate scientists tell us we can expect more of as we destabilise the climate. This National Party government has a policy of destabilising the climate so that our children inherit out-of-control climate change. Now, the noise that people might hear in the background is the heckling from the government ministers who are climate change deniers. They deny the science of climate change, which is remarkable. They're very happy to have the science that sits behind their mobile phones or the science that sits behind their computers, but when it comes to the science behind climate, all of a sudden they become science deniers. Oh no, we don't want to have that kind of science. We don't like the climate science. And so they heckle repeatedly about how they don't like climate science. But the fact is that climate science tells us very clearly that if we keep increasing our greenhouse emissions, we will destabilise the climate and we will result in more extreme weather events, the kind of extreme weather events that we have seen in southern England and the Philippines in recent past. And it is under this government's policies, the plan is to increase greenhouse emissions, net greenhouse emissions from New Zealand by 50%. And the government may shout and scream about it and heckle about how much they hate science and they're not going to base their policy on science, but the science around climate is pretty settled now. We have very large studies have been done by thousands of climate scientists across the world and have now reached these conclusions. And yet still we have the deniers in this very parliament who are screaming and shouting, as climate deniers do, that they don't accept the science around climate. And that is why, when we have this bill in front of us, which should be putting a price on carbon, there is no price on carbon and New Zealand's greenhouse emissions will increase. On top of that, we have increasing inequality in New Zealand. The Labour Cost Index, which according to the Department of Statistics is the way to measure changes in earnings over time, tells us that wages, since this government came in, wages have increased 9.3%, while inflation has increased 10.5%, according to the Department of Statistics Labour Cost Index, which is what they tell us to use. So wages have gone backwards compared to inflation. Real wages are declining in New Zealand under this government. That is the statistics according to the Department of Statistics, the one measure that they tell us to use to measure changes in earnings over time, which is the Labour Cost Index. Mr. Speaker, all of these things are happening under this government. Then we have the structural imbalances which the government is making worse, which is reflected in the current account deficit. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand says the current account deficit in New Zealand will increase to 5.8% of GDP by 2016. That is 5.8% of GDP. We will have to borrow or sell assets in order to cover the current account deficit. That is what a current account deficit means. So yes, there is a short-term stimulatory effect going on in the economy at the moment, but it is funded by borrowing and by selling assets to offshore owners. That is not a sustainable strategy for Aotearoa New Zealand. That is not smarter, greener economics. That is going backwards, and it's our children that are going to have to pay, and the next government's going to have to fix it up.
Maggie Berry.